Good evening, everyone. I'm Stephen Barktis, the curator of the Gunn Historical Museum in Washington, Connecticut. Thank you for joining us for How the Lake Waramaug Task Force Brought the Lake Back from the Brink. This is the second lecture in our series on Lake Waramaug. This evening, Sean Hayden, our distinguished guest, will share the story of the task force's dedicated efforts that achieved amazing results in restoring the lake's water quality. Gene Solomon, a trustee of the Gunn Memorial Library and Museum, will be introducing him. During this lecture, we ask that you please mute both your audio and video settings. If you have questions, you may submit them throughout the lecture in the chat box, and Sean will answer some of them at the end. This is our last Zoom guest lecture of the spring season, and we look forward to reconnecting with you in the fall. Now, I'd like to hand it over to Gene.
Hello and good evening. My name is Gene Solomon. It is my great pleasure to welcome our guest lecturer, Sean Hayden. For the past 4 years, Sean has served as the executive director of the Lake Waramaug Task Force. He has over 30 years of experience in environmental conservation and an in-depth knowledge of the ecology and history of Lake Waramaug. Prior to joining the task force, Sean spent 18 years as executive director and soil scientist at the Northwest Conservation District. During his tenure there, Sean worked side by side with the 34 towns and residents of Northwest Connecticut, including the task force, to conserve natural resources by using sustainable development strategies. He is an expert in low impact development and a certified soil scientist, Army Corps of Engineers wetlands delineator, and professional in erosion and sediment control. He has worked with multiple wetlands and zoning commissions to revise municipal regulations, watershed planning, sediment and erosion control, and stormwater quality management plans. Prior to working at the Northwest Conservation District, Sean spent 3 years as an agroforester with the Peace Corps in Kenya. He graduated from the University of Connecticut with a Bachelor of Science in Renewable Natural Resource Management and Engineering. He and his wife, Rose Guimaraes, lived in Torrington and are avid outdoors people. Thank you, Sean, for your participation here this evening. And now I'll hand this over to you.
Thank you, Gene. Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, I want to thank you guys too, because, you know, the task force has done so much over the last almost 50 years to help bring Lake Waramaug back from the brink. And, you know, a lot of their work goes unnoticed, and no pun intended, a lot of the work that goes on is below the surface of the water too. So it is a great opportunity to showcase everything that we're doing. Now I'm gonna stop sharing for just a second because my slideshow has decided to stall on me, but we'll get reconnected here. And the other thing, while I'm doing that, I want to tell you about one other part of my history, and that is when I got out of college, I went right into environmental consulting. And as an environmental consultant, I went to a lot of Superfund sites as to help clean them up, design cleanups for Superfund sites. I went all over America and went to these real environmental tragedies that exist all over America. And I realized that the job was fascinating, but I wanted to be responsible for protecting what we have rather than trying to clean up a mess that was, you know, that was really too late. When you get to the point of being a Superfund site, it's really too late. You have a serious problem on your hands. So, okay, so that we are back online and I'm moving along here. Chris Adams talked about the Lakes region past several hundred years, and I wanted to pick up where she left off. Her talk last month was really an eye-opener for me. And the one big takeaway I had from watching Chris's talk was how Lake Waramaug was getting loved to death. It became more and more popular because it was a beautiful spot. It became a destination for so many folks, and inns popped up and more summer cottages were built. And this is all constructed before there was any kind of strict septic health code. So the lake really started to suffer, and it was truly dying. There was, algae blooms were occurring, just turning the lake completely green for large portions of the summer. And I wanted to first start by talking about what was happening in the America's conscious when it comes to environmentalism at this point, when the lake was really starting to suffer in the 70s. Of course, we all know about the Cuyahoga River catches fire, many times in Ohio. But another thing that happened was the first Earth Day. And that's an important landmark in the environmental movement. And it was really has a legacy of empowering communities with information, how to look at, pay attention to clean water and the science involved with following and tracking it to see how it's behaving and its health, and using land use tools needed to protect water quality, using simple structures, techniques, development styles, all the things that you need to do to help protect clean water. And then in '72, the Clean Water Act came along. And it was interesting, when I was reading through that, I noticed at the bottom, it has some of the goals that the Clean Water Act wanted to achieve. And that is to make all US waters fishable and swimmable in 1983. Now, I don't think they've achieved that goal, but we're still certainly maybe in Lake Waramaug, but there's plenty of waters in the United States that are still in trouble. But then in 1975, a task force was formed and established by the Regional Council of Governments, or the Northwest Hills. It's now the Litchfield Hill Council of Governments, which is the regional planning agency. And this task force was formed out of the regional planning agency as a concern of the plummeting water quality conditions in Lake Waramaug. It was, and I'll explain to you how bad it got in the following slides. But I think what I wanted to mention about the Clean Water Act is that embedded in the Clean Water Act was something called the Clean Lakes Fund, which designated millions of dollars to Connecticut to help clean up the contaminated waterways in Connecticut. And the original task force that was established by the Council of Governments tapped into this money to do some really cutting edge science and work on Lake Waramaug to create the systems that are working today to protect the lake. And then in '82, the Lake Waramaug Task Force incorporated as a 501c3 nonprofit. I think if you talk about the entire history of the task force, you need to talk about Tom Mcgowan. Tom Mcgowan was a planner with the Council of Governments, and he was the task force first executive director. And he worked as the executive director for, I think, 40 years. Tom, you'll correct me if I'm wrong. And I took over from Tom in about 4 to 5 years ago. And we're lucky to have him, as he's a volunteer for the task force, and he's on our board of directors. And I really lean on Tom for the historical information about how the task force worked through a number of the issues that happened on the lake. He's just been an invaluable wellspring of information that's really helped me work with the task force to continue improving the water quality in Lake Waramaug. I wanted to start by one of the big things the task force does is they do limnology, which is the study of lakes, the physical, the chemical properties, how it it gains and loses heat, how it layers up over the seasons, how what plants and animals live in, the whole science of looking at the health of a lake. And the simplest yet most effective tool that we use to test the lake weekly is something called a Secchi disc. And this is just a simple weighted black and white disc that we lower into the lake, and we lower it until it disappears. And that's the lake's clarity, how many meters we lower it into the lake. So the history of the Secchi disc was, it's been used in limnology for about 150 years. And it was invented or created by Alfredo Secchi. And he adopted it from a disc that the ancient mariners used when they plied the oceans. They would drop this white disc into the water and lower it and see what color the disc would turn, based on where it was in the water column. And they would be able to tell which way the currents were going if they couldn't see land or the sky, or if they were having trouble navigating. They could actually tell which way the currents were going based on the color of the water. So that's a little backstory on the Secchi disc. But the reason I tell that story is when I got to this is a photo of one of our volunteers doing a Secchi depth reading, where she's lowering it into the lake till it disappears and getting an actual reading. And we have Secchi depths reading for Lake Waramaug going back almost 50 years. And I just want to tell you a quick story from my experience coming onto the task force, because I'm a soil scientist. I didn't, as far as limnology, did take a course in college, but I didn't take any formal limnology training. So when I first got to the task force, I thought, well, it's time to go out to the lake and do some Secchi readings. And I did a few, and I got the hang of it. And then I took those readings and I went back to a history of all the Secchi depths readings throughout the decades for Lake Waramaug. And I noticed some negative numbers. And I'm just going to flip back to that original green slide. While this is not how it looked back in the 70s, I just want to have this slide here in the background while I tell the story. So I looked at this data and I noticed that some of the readings were negative. In other words, they lowered the depth of clarity was a negative number. In other words, the Secchi disc disappeared before it even hit the surface of the water. And I couldn't figure out, I thought it was a mistake. And so I called the limnologist. I was like, how does the Secchi disc how is the water quality so bad that it disappears before it even hits the surface of the water? There must be some mistake in this data. And he goes, no, Sean, it's not a mistake. The lake was foaming and frothing and blooming and green and had this thick layer of foam on top from the algae blooms. And the Secchi disc actually disappeared in froth before it even hit the surface of the water. So that really struck home for me to understand the state the lake was in when the task force was first formed. Now, there's two types of threats that I parse our work into, and that's in-lake threats and watershed threats. And I'm going to start with the in-lake threats and how we manage them and how the task force has developed systems to help combat these threats. And the first one is, I'm sure you've all seen them, are those mysterious bubbles that come up from the lake in locations around the lake. And every year 911 gets called, a boat has sank, a car drove into the water, or it's hot springs that are underneath Lake Waramaug. I've heard it pretty much all. But the real story is underneath the water column in 4 locations around the lake, there's these massive school bus size aeration towers that are suspended in the water column. And they're turned on during the warm months to help circulate and aerate the water. And I'll show you how they work. It's pretty ingenious. Now on the land, we have two massive air compressors that feed the aerators thousands of cubic feet of air every day. And this is a schematic of one of the towers off of Washington Beach. And you can see the arrows when the air is pumped at the bottom of this aeration tower, suspended in the water column, it actually drags water into it. Sorry about that. It actually drags water into it at a low level where the water is cool, and also drags water in at a higher level in the lake elevation to mix it. There's a bunch of baffles inside that fabricated fiberglass tower, and then it shoots it out in the middle. And what the mixed water and aerated water out in the middle, and what that does is it actually makes the middle of the lake fatter and pushes that nutrient-rich near sediment bottom water down lower into the lake and starves the cyanobacteria that are floating near the surface where they can get light. So they need to photosynthesize. And cyanobacteria can actually sink and float depending on where they want to be in the water column. And these aeration towers actually keep the food far enough away or far enough down in the lake so the cyanobacteria can't make it all the way down to the nutrient-rich water and then float all the way back to the surface to photosynthesize. It's too long a distance. So while the aerators do put oxygen into the lake, which helps, their main function is to hide food from the cyanobacteria. And we'll be turning them on shortly, so you'll see the bubbles start up in the next week or so. Now, the next threat that happened in the history of Lake Waramaug was alewives were stocked into the lake in order, because the Connecticut DEP had visions of Lake Waramaug being a trophy bass fishing lake. And so they stocked it with alewife. And unfortunately, what happened, alewife are ferocious feeders on zooplankton. And the zooplankton population completely crashed. And I'm going to give you guys a little science here. This is the food web of zooplankton, alewife, and cyanobacteria. And there will be a test at the end. So what happened was they introduced alewife. It completely devastated the zooplankton population. And zooplankton, one of their favorite foods are cyanobacteria or blue-green algae. And so with absolutely no predators left for the cyanobacteria, they had a party, they had a field day. And that after this, a few years after that alewife stocking, the lake experienced some of its worst blooms that people had ever seen. So the task force decided to attack this from two directions because there's no way to get rid of all the alewife from the lake. So 20 years ago, the task force started to stock foot-long brown trout into the lake. Actually, anywhere from 1,000 to 1,500 foot-long brown trout are stocked into the lake every fall by the task force in an effort to predate on those alewife and reduce the population so that the zooplankton have a chance to rebound. So we're attacking the alewife from a predator point of view to help the zooplankton. But the other thing that we're doing to help out the zooplankton is we actually have a zooplankton farm out on Arrow Point where there's a large, we have large incubation tanks that actually grow zooplankton. And we're trying to get it. A few times last year, we had almost 1 million zooplankton produced a week and released. We're going to try to do better than that this summer. We have some tweaks we want to make to the farm. And hopefully we can restore the zooplankton population in the lake to what it was when the lake was a lot healthier. Another threat to Lake Waramaug is invasive aquatic weeds. And the lake has 4 invasives in it, but this one is called water chestnut, but the one that's really aggressive and can really take over the lake and choke out all the native plants is something called curly-leaf pondweed. And that's what the task force had to deal with in the beginning of the 2000s. It showed up in the lake in just a few species, a few individual plants, actually, in the beginning of the 2000s. And then it just exploded. And so about 20 years ago now, the task force hired a team of limnologists to do surveys every spring. So this boat you're seeing on the is a boat you've probably seen around the lake, usually in May and June, and then sometimes in September. The guy in the front has a lake rake, and he is raking the bottom of the lake for taking samples of what's growing in the lake. The woman in the middle has a GPS unit, and if he finds something, he logs it, the species, the number count, and everything. And then there's a driver. And this is a process that sometimes takes, the most of 2 days. And they switch positions so they don't they get to stretch their legs. Then they take that file created by the GPS unit is then transferred to our suction harvester dive team, which is a team of divers, and they have this Mad Max looking boat with huge pumps on them that there's actually 2 divers underneath this boat hand pulling plants from the sediment, putting them into the vacuum hoses, and they get pumped up onto the deck and put in netted bags. And you can see the 2 netted bags being filled with plants on the deck of the boat. And there's a picture of what the divers look like with their with the suction dive tube and their aeration lines that are actually, they don't have tanks on. The compressed air is made on the boat, so they don't have to lug around heavy air tanks all the time. And they're going to be out. You'll probably see them on the lake. I would say in the next 2 to 3 weeks, they're going to start to just poke around and see if they can find anything. But I want to tell you the story. Well, here's a picture of what it looks like on the deck of the boat after they've netted bags and bags of it. But I want to tell you that there's other invasives in the lake. Curly by far is the most dominant and aggressive, and it has a voracious reproductive habit and can get into all corners of the lake really quick. And the other 3 invasive plants we have in the lake are easily controlled by task force staff. We go out and kayak and do some surveys, and every time we spot one, we just pull it up. Water chestnut's one of those. We can pretty much keep that in check, and there's very few plants left in the lake. We just go out every year to mop up any leftover plants that we might have missed or that had grown up from seeds from the year before that we couldn't see. But so we have the suction harvesters, we do it ourselves, but we also do invasive aquatic weed trainings which I think, the more eyes on the lake, the better. And I want to tell you that people call the task force a lot saying, we have a lot more weeds around our dock or in our swimming area. We're really concerned. Can you come out and take a look at it to see if there's a problem? And we do that. And so feel free, if you see something that looks out of sorts and different than you usually see around your dock, then just call me and I'll bring the lake rake and our research boat and I'll take a look at it. But I think the important part about the training is teaching people what the natives look like, because we have a really good population of native species in the lake, and a good healthy population of native plants is excellent because those aquatic plants absorb the nutrients that the cyanobacteria would feed on. So the more healthy, the thicker, more rich plant beds you have, the less nutrients you'll have in the water to allow blooms to occur from cyanobacteria. So we like native plants, and we like folks keeping an eye out and helping us spot them if things don't look right. And that's just one of the trainings we do, and bring samples into the into the, to be studied, closely looked at rather than in the lake. And this, this is one of my excursions going out. Somebody on Arrow Point had an explosion of weeds off their swimming area and was concerned. And it turned out to be a native called Robin's pondweed. And what's been happening over the years, because the task force, because the water has cleared up so much from the past, light is able to get farther into the lake. And now we have a healthier and healthier native plant populations because light is able to penetrate deeper into the lake. So not only are the plant beds getting thicker, they're also expanding because their habitat is expanding, which is all good news for water quality. Now, to wrap up our assault on invasive weeds, this map was made at the beginning of the 2000s. And each one of these colored dots is a GPS coordinate, but it's a GPS coordinate for a whole population of plants. Some of these dots represent hundreds of plants. And this was what the lake condition was in the beginning of the 2000s. There was literally, 100 locations where there were hundreds of plants, and we had our work, or the task force at least had their work cut out for them to get these under control. And the task force has never liked the idea of using chemicals. So that's why the hand pulling is done by the staff and the suction harvesting is done by the dive crew. But this is the early 2000s. Now this is today, or I should say the beginning of last summer. Now, yeah, there's a few dots on here, but those represent single plants. They don't represent populations. These are literally the only invasive plants left at the beginning of last year, and the divers pulled all them. And so the task force has really virtually eradicated non-native invasive plants from Lake Waramaug. It's quite a impressive feat, and there's no other lake in Connecticut they can say that they've eradicated all invasive weeds without the use of chemicals. So it's been a real win for the lake. We continue to do our weekly water quality data during the summer, constantly keep an eye on the water column to better understand how cyanobacteria are behaving, which species are thriving, how to fine tune the aerators if we need to, depending on how the water column is setting up. It's something the task force has done from the beginning is just constant vigilant, keeping an eye on the lake. We also, the task force used to do a lot of sampling every winter. They'd go out on the lake with all our sampling equipment. And this was in February in 2017, I believe. And, we drilled a hole in the lake and did sampling. But lately, we have not been able to count on solid ice cover to be able to get out there every year. So, and having winter data is really important to understand how the lake is gaining and losing heat, how it's setting up. It's just a really important data point. And if there's no ice, we can't get out there to do it. However, just recently, we've created a new program where we actually create a string of data loggers in the deepest part of the lake. And you can see the data loggers on the deck connected to the ropes and the buoy. And we have a data logger at almost every meter in the lake that's in there 24/7, 365. And it's collecting temperature and oxygen at almost every meter, every 20 seconds. And they're out there right now collecting data, and we'll pull them up in the next month. We put them out there last November. We'll pull them up in the next month, download all the data from them, put fresh batteries in them, and just throw them right back in the lake. So this is an important tool for us, as we can no longer count on a safe, solid ice cover to do regular sampling during the winter. This is me just dropping them back in. Now that's the that's the in-lake threats that we focus on. I mean, there are other things, but when it comes right down to it, the task force has done an awful lot of in-lake work to help bring the lake back. And if we're going to continue to improve the water quality of the lake, we got to head to the watershed. The task force has always done work in the watershed, but there's a lot of additional information that we need to test and sample and understand about how the watershed feeds nutrients to the lake to continue to address the negative impacts of climate change on the watershed and to continue improving the lake's water quality. So, and I like to start this section, the watershed section, by showing you, this is just a short section of West Shore Road in Washington along, midway through West Shore Road. And this aerial photo was taken in 1950. And you can see, you can't even see the road. I think back then it might've been a dirt cow path or something, very, very minor. And there's not a lot of houses or lawn. But I'm going to toggle back and forth between today and 1950. And you can see that there's not only the road get a lot wider, but there's a whole bunch of new houses, a lot more lawn, a lot more shoreline development, a lot more land disturbance, a lot more impervious surfaces, just things that have a negative water quality impact on the lake. And the reason that is, when you create a lot of pavement, driveways, rooftops, there's nutrients and pollution falling out of the sky. Even when it's sunny, there's phosphorus falling out of the sky that cyanobacteria love. It lands on pavement and washes right off into the lake. It's not a problem if it's falling on a forest because the trees will just absorb it and use it for food. But if it falls on pavement and it's not controlled properly, it goes directly into the lake. And now you're growing cyanobacteria in the lake instead of growing trees in the watershed. So the task force started to do a catch basin study of every single catch basin around the lake. There's about 140 of them. And so far we've cataloged every single one, mapped it, ranked it for its potential to pollute the lake, attached it to a network where the outfalls go into the lake. And now we're sampling, during stormwater events, we're sampling different locations around the lake to figure out where the pollution loading is coming from now from the watershed and getting into the lake. And once we can find out exactly where the hot spots are, we can't address problems in the entire watershed, but if we focus on the hot spots where nutrients are getting into the lake and address those one by one, we'll be able to further continue the water quality improvement in Lake Waramaug. We're also do regular stream sampling of a number of tributaries to Lake Waramaug to understand if there is any kind of pollutant loading coming from higher in the watershed, up in the higher reaches away from the lake. Because once pollution gets into the stream, it's only a few minutes to the lake, no matter where you are in the watershed. It doesn't take long for pollution to get into the water, get into a stream high in the watershed, and it's into the lake in minutes. It's once it gets into a stream, it's too late. So we also keep an eye on the streams to figure out if there's any large pollutant loading sources coming from upstream. Another concern I've had as a soil scientist, and the trend I'm seeing around Lake Waramaug is, there's development, but it's just not your average development. When something gets constructed, it's really built property line to property line. There's a lot of soil disturbance and there's a lot of grading, a lot of exposed soil. And if you get a really good heavy rainstorm, like the one we just had, the water quickly erodes a lot of the soil on site. And if your erosion and sediment control plan isn't buttoned up tight, the nutrient-rich sediment washes right into streams and then right into the lake. And the problem with this is and this is a picture of a site on Lake Waramaug a few years ago. And this is a picture of the lake receiving a huge slug of polluted sediments that gets into the lake. And the problem with this is the lake can't get rid of it. It settles to the bottom, the nutrients, the sediment, and then it constantly emits like a battery and keeps feeding it back to the water column, depending on water conditions and currents and chemistry. And you have a constant source of nutrients now that the lake can't get rid of. And that's why I offer to the land use departments in all three towns, I say, if you want me to come out with you when you're doing site inspections on construction sites, I'm more than welcome to come along and put in my recommendations and comments about how to keep the erosion sediment control tight so that sediments won't get into the lake. It's a free service that task force provides to the land use departments in all three towns. The other watershed project that the task force started back in 2009 was they wanted a watershed management plan that looked at erosion sites all along Sucker Brook, which is the largest tributary to Lake Waramaug. And when I worked for the Conservation District, Tom Mcgowan asked me to do this study. And so what I did was I started at the lake, standing in Sucker Brook, and I walked in the stream all the way up to downtown Warren. It was a couple miles of in-stream walking, and I documented, GPS located, pictured, and ranked all the erosion sites all the way up through the watershed, so that the task force would have a blueprint and a ranking system to start to address these erosion sites. Because, like I said in the previous slides, if soil gets into the lake, it's a permanent source of pollution. So if we could stabilize a bunch of these erosion sites on Sucker Brook, we'd be removing a huge pollutant loading source to the lake effectively. And this is one of the worst erosion sites, and this was about halfway up the watershed. And the task force was able, because it was the worst one and it was ranked that way in the plan, they designed a fix for it and had it installed. And now this site is contributing, while it used to contribute hundreds of cubic yards of sediment into the stream and into the lake, now it's completely stabilized and contributing no more pollution to the lake. And there's about 7 severe locations where there was erosion from that original study. The task force has stabilized 3 of them, and 2 of them are in planning stages right now. So it's a big project. It's an expensive project. The task force has raised money and paid for them all, and we will keep whittling away at them. Another service we provide in the watershed to farms is I do soil nutrient sampling, and there's a number of reasons why we do this and why I think it's important. And the first is, if you put too much fertilizer on the ground, the soil can't handle it, and if the plants can't take it up, it's going into the lake with stormwater runoff. And second, a farmer's wasting their money if they're putting too much nutrients on soil that already have plenty of nutrients in them. So before the growing season, there's a number of farms which I sample and see what the nutrient content is in the soil, and then the farmer can base his fertilizer application rates based on what he wants to grow, the soil's capability, and just another way the task force is working to keep nutrients out of the lake that originate in the watershed. In the past, the task force has worked with the agricultural community, and this project happened in 1990, where there was a farm with probably 150 head of cattle on the farm, and there was a heavy use area, the barnyard and areas around the barns and the feeding areas, which were producing a lot of nutrient-rich runoff into the stream, into Sucker Brook. So the task force raised funding to build a large catchment lagoon that captured all the polluted stormwater runoff from the farming operation. And then all that nutrient-rich water was pumped onto hayfields and sprayed onto hayfields. So again, there's the story of growing hay, a valuable product, on the land rather than growing cyanobacteria in the lake if a structure like this wasn't installed. Another real success story. And I wanted to end up tonight talking about a study I came across a number of years ago. And this was done by the US Park Service on the wild and scenic portion of the Farmington River, which comes out of Massachusetts and goes through New Hartford, Barkhamsted, Riverton, Canton, those upper tier Litchfield County towns. And it's a world-renowned trout fishing stream, and people come from all over to fly fish in the Farmington River in this section. And so the Park Service wanted to understand what value a clean water resource brought to that community. What added value did a clean water resource bring to that community? So in other words, they looked at everything. They looked at real estate values. They looked at the increase in businesses, stores, rental shops, all the stuff associated with having a clean water resource in their backyard. And they calculated, as compared to communities that did not have a clean water or had a polluted water resource in their backyard, this brought 10 to 20 million extra dollars annually to these small towns. And I am absolutely convinced that if a similar study was done on Waramaug and what the clean water value was to the communities around Lake Waramaug, I would put it in the hundreds of millions of dollars of that lake, that clean water resource, and the value it brings to the surrounding communities. So it's just something to think about, and it's a study I'd love to commission, because I know in my gut that having that clean water resource in the backyards of those three towns is a huge value to the local economies. Now, speaking of economy, the task force's budget averages around $300,000 a year. And all our funding, or over 90% of our funding, comes from the generosity of the lake, the folks around the lake communities, and people who like to visit the lake. We have a great population of really generous donors that enable us to do this work year after year. And this pie chart just shows you sort of how our budget breaks down and how much we spend on each one of the individual projects, and both in the watershed and in the lake. And I think Gene and Stephen will make this slideshow available if you want to look at the details. But I wanted to leave you in working with the conservation district from the year 2000 to 2017. I had a lot of opportunity to work with a bunch of different lake management folks here in Litchfield County. And I know this is a fact for certainly Northwest Connecticut, and probably is a fact for the rest of the state. And that is that Lake Waramaug is a true success story, in that over the last 20 years, Lake Waramaug has been improving. Its water quality parameters have been improving. There's been less cyanobacteria blooms. There hasn't been any for quite a while. There's lower concentrations of phosphorus in the lake. The clarities on average are getting better and better. I don't believe there's any other lake in Connecticut can say they're having these kind of trends, including the eradication of all invasive weeds. there's no lake that can talk about these trends over the last 20 years, but Lake Waramaug has it. And the reason I like to tell this story is we hear a lot of environmental disaster stories. If you know, watching the news, you know, there's a lot of gloom and doom happening out there, and Lake Waramaug and the work the task force done is a real bright light in the storyline of what you can do when you focus on science, community involvement, and just whittling away at the problems and issues that can contaminate the lake. So I think that's pretty much it. And I would love to answer any. I threw a whole bunch of stuff at you, and I would love to answer any questions you folks might have.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sean. I mean, this is just fascinating, and you and your team have just done an extraordinary job, far more than I ever knew about. And I'm sure that our audience feels the same. I mean, it's just been extraordinary, you know, with the watershed and in the water, under the water, on top of the water, going in the water. So it's just been fascinating. So there have been some questions here. So Joan Eibler asks, do all lakes need such oversight to remain healthy?
I think any lake with any kind of substantial development on it definitely needs someone to keep. It needs a lot of people keeping an eye on things, and that's where, you know, the Lake Waramaug has really been lucky. There's actually 4 organizations. The task force has done a lot of the science and a lot of the in-lake projects. However, there's the Lake Waramaug Association helping with lake issues. There's the Lake Waramaug Authority. There's also the Lake Waramaug Interlocal Commission. And Lake Waramaug is lucky. It's had a lot of good folks paying close attention to it. And I think if you want to see your lake improve, that's what you need to do.
Another question here, Joanne Cafiero is asking, is the task force volunteer or paid?
The task force board of directors, there's 15 of them, and they're all volunteers. I am the only full-time employee at the task force, so I am paid. And we also have 4 part-timers, research assistant, bookkeeper, a technical assistant. So we do have paid staff also.
So Maureen and Joe Parati are asking, how is all this equipment funded? I mean, you showed us so many fun, I mean, who's ever seen those incredible, they're fiberglass shafts, right? I mean, those were unique, weren't they? Weren't they?
Yeah.
Novel? I mean, it was just totally new for the lake.
Jean, thanks for saying that, because that aeration technology was first tested and thought of and created on Lake Waramaug. There were prototypes built. Remember I told you at the beginning of the show how the Clean Water Act had the Clean Lakes funding? It actually helped to fund some prototypes of those types of aerators in the lake. And the task force worked looking at the lake science, looking at the data that had been collected over the decades. And then, because those aerators have to be custom designed and hung in the exact right location in the lake in order for them to work properly. And you need data to do that. And so when the task force created this aeration system, and it was such a success, now it's used all over the country, and mostly in drinking water reservoirs. There's not a lot of recreational lakes that use the technology, but it was first discovered and created by the task force and its limnological consultants. And you know, we can say that Lake Waramaug was the first.
That's fantastic. That's a great success story. That's amazing. So Carol and John Santoleri are asking, what specifically can homeowners do to prevent the construction runoff, erosion, or erosion generally? I think
that, you know, while every property is different and every property can have its challenges, I think if you pay attention, the best thing you can do as a property owner is know where your impervious surfaces are and know where that water's going. And if it's going directly into a catch basin that's piped directly to the lake, that's a problem. You want to cut that off. And there's lots of different ways to do it. But if anybody has an impervious surface that's draining right to the lake and they want to give me a call and I can come out and take a look at it, I'd love to do that, because there's such a huge universe of landscape techniques, simple grading, simple structures sometimes that work to intercept that stormwater runoff and keep it from going directly into the lake and putting it into the soil, growing trees and flowers rather than cyanobacteria in the lake.
Thank you. Karen Carter is asking, in your experience, how and to what extent do septic failures affect the lake?
Yeah, what a spectacular question. I have seen lakes in Connecticut with houses with septic systems, and I've seen lakes with town sewers going all the way around them and taking the sewer away. And I have to say that probably in the 50s, 60s, home sewage was a problem. But I want to tell you now, whenever a house is rebuilt or remodeled or built, we have a really thick septic health code now. It's inches thick. And a property owner has to design a septic system that is heavily engineered and designed to last 50 to 100 years. And it's one of the strictest health codes in the nation. Connecticut has for septics. And so, and people building a house will tell you, it's like, wow, the septic system costs as much as my house, because sometimes you have really poor soil and you have to do a lot of work.
Sure.
But I want to make sure I'm answering the question. And I think the question is, do you think that septics are having a negative impact on the lake now? And I think the answer to that is no, because of that health code. And I think, and this is from experience with towns that put sewers all the way around their lake, connecting themselves to town sewers, and they're still having severe water quality problems, even though there's no more sewers around the lake. And the reason is because they're not addressing their stormwater runoff. And that is the number one threat to Lake Waramaug. And that's what I'm focused on, is addressing those sources of pollutant coming from uncontrolled direct inputs of stormwater runoff.
Yeah,
I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, well, that's fascinating to know. Thank you. So Doreen is asking, she says she works at Hopkins Vineyard and she drives by this beautiful lake every week. So she says, thank you. But she's also saying, do you have expertise in ponds as well?
Yes, I do. As in my experience as a soil scientist at the conservation district, before I got there, it turns out that they had built an awful lot of ponds. That was one of the things they did, is they built agricultural ponds. So my phone rang all the time with people with pond questions. Even though I'm a soil scientist, I got to know ponds pretty well. And if folks asked me questions above my pay grade, so to speak, I always knew where to send them. So, but I might be able to answer some pond questions. So give me a call.
All right, here's a question. Peter Lewis, I think, who's saying he's hoping that you will comment on one of the latest lake threats, which is zebra mussels.
Yeah, that's a real concern. I mean, there's a few things Lake Waramaug has going for it. And one is that we're not a calcareous lake, we're an acid lake. In other words, we don't have any limestone in our watershed. So we don't have a lot of calcium in our lake water column, which zebra mussels like. It's preferred habitat for them. They like limestone rich, water that's come out of limestone rich watersheds. And we don't have that in Lake Waramaug. The other
Yeah.
thing we have is a boat inspection program where every single power boat that gets on the lake goes through a rigorous inspection. The trailer, the hull, everything gets looked at. Now, is that going to catch a zebra mussel, V'ger or Voyager, whatever they're, the small zebra mussel? If it's in a wake boat tank or, carried somewhere out of sight,
Mhm.
it's truly, it is a threat to Waramaug, and it's something that we're certainly going to keep an eye on.
Sure. Just getting back to the equipment that we were talking about just a little while ago. So question is, how do these pieces of equipment get paid for? Because they're, significant. And is it through grants? Is it through donations? How does that get done?
Over the task force budget we're a private nonprofit. We get no state, no municipal, no federal funding. We raise all our money through the generosity of our donors and through writing grants. So we're a private standalone nonprofit who is lucky that we have a large population of really generous donors. And my grant writing pen isn't bad either.
Okay. Can you comment on how that task force has interacted with the campground, the beach park area over the years?
Yeah, well, the park definitely it's the largest landowner on the lake. It has a half a mile of shoreline on the lake, and that's the largest single property owner on the lake. And it just so happens that, that property is managed in a way that's very friendly to the resident goose population. And I have been working there's a new park manager over there who I've met a couple of times and had conversations with. And I think we're going to start doing a demonstration project over there on how to deter geese from freely accessing that property. That's going to be a long project, though. We have to whittle away at it.
Yeah. So here's Shmuel Yerushalmi. He's looking to find out if there's a project of popular ecological tourism. So I don't know. You've talked a lot about it, but I think what's happened, and I'm just going to jump in for a second, the lake has changed its identity over time. So it used to be much more public. And now there's been private development around the lake. And, with Chris's lecture, we saw, I think there were like 15 hotels. There was a casino. There was a lot more activity that was public. So, but anyway, ecological tourism is popular. So is there any opportunity for that?
I think, yeah, I guess Lake Waramaug does have a little bit of a reputation as being closed, but there is a public boat launch and there is a public state park on it. I guess I'm not quite sure, what the question is when it comes to is the person thinking about what opportunities there might be for ecological tourism?
I think so, but yeah,
that one I'd have to chew on.
Okay.
I'm going to punt on that one.
Okay.
Give me another softball question. Come on.
All right. How does the use of lawn fertilizers and weed control have an impact on the lake? The fertilizers and weed control used by homes around the lake impact the lake? And do you have any recommendations as to using alternatives?
When it comes to fertilizer, I think homeowners and their land managers should be doing the exact same thing I'm doing for farmers, and that is checking the soil, see if it needs anything first. Before you go hitting it with fertilizer, get your soil tested. It's really cheap. The state subsidizes the soil testing lab at UConn. So I think it's for $8 or $10, you can get a full scan of what's in your soil and what it needs or what it doesn't need, more importantly. And you just got to tell them what you want to grow. Is it grass? Is it vegetables? Is it perennials? And they'll tell you exactly what you should be putting on it to grow that specific stock. And they'll give you an application rate if something is needed. So it's a really useful tool, but I don't think enough people take advantage of it. It's just a little bit of planning because they get busy this time of year. You got to get those soil samples sent out. It might be a week or two turnaround, but if your land manager are doing things once a month, you have plenty of time to get a soil sample sent out to see what you should be doing. And as far as chemicals go, when it comes to herbicides, I just want to say one thing, and that is, less is always better. And the task force has really focused on never having to use chemicals in the lake, because you never know what side effects can come out of it. And that's why our invasive weed eradication story is so powerful, in that you can do it mechanically without using any chemicals. And I got to imagine there's creative ways that you could manage noxious weeds on the shore too, or on land or in the watershed.
Here's one last question, and I don't know if it can be, it's probably a big one, but how do you see climate change affecting the lake?
Yeah, and well, one of the things, climate change is affecting the lake. I mean, I want to say that first right out. We know it is. We know that, we're having these warmer falls later and later into the year. We're having ice on the lake later. And that's one of the things, we have those data logger, that string of data loggers in the lake. That is going to really help us understand how the lake is gaining and losing heat 24/7, from now on, so that we'll be able to see effects in the water column. But the problem with climate change is while we may be getting the same amount of rain in a year, around 50 inches, it's falling in storms that are way more intense. They're shorter, and they tend to entrain stormwater and things at the surface a lot quicker. And that's another reason why we want to start really focusing in on stormwater runoff in the watershed and those pollutant loading sources, because with the increase in the intensity of these rainstorms we've been getting, stormwater runoff is going to entrain more pollution and become a bigger problem in the lake. So that's probably the two biggest things I see, how climate change is impacting the lake. But stay tuned. I'm sure there's going to be some more that we find out.
Okay, I think that's pretty much the time that we have this evening. And this has just been absolutely fascinating, and just really an eye-opener. Really, you guys have done a sensational job and accomplished so much. So I want to thank you, Sean, again, for enlightening us.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
Okay, for your extraordinary efforts and remarkable results in recovering Lake Waramaug. And I'd like to give special thanks to our sponsors for this lecture, the Lake Waramaug Association and the Lake Waramaug Task Force. And thank all of you in our audience for your attendance, and please enjoy the rest of your evening.